Hey everybody, this is Rick Thiessen, Senior Pastor of Allen Creek Community Church, and welcome to PHYST. Pastor, P-H-Y-S-T. Yes, see how that acronym works? PHYST. You got to know English to know how that works as far as an actual, rendering of, English phonetics. But there it is. That is our little name for our little segment here, where we talk about internet content that you send us to this address right here, social@ac3.org, and we comment. So let's comment on this particular video that was sent in to us. And well, it looks like it has to do with Mark Driscoll thinks I'm going to hell. This should be super interesting.
Here's what he has to say and why I think he's wrong.
If there is a hell and you don't believe in it, you've got a problem.
Okay, so we're going to go with the fear tactics right out of the gate. Cool.
Jesus talks about hell more than anyone.
This is misleading. Jesus talks about Gehenna more than anyone, which is not a spiritual place. It was a real place, a valley just outside the gates of Jerusalem. This is a metaphor. This metaphor is borrowed from the prophet Jeremiah, who talked about Gehenna as a place where the dead bodies of Israelites would be thrown after Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. Jesus seems to be using it in a similar way, warning Jerusalem that unless they repent, they will also be destroyed by the Romans, which they were about 30 years after the life of Jesus.
Okay, so this is true that Gehenna is a reference to the local dump in Jerusalem, but it's not true that this is merely a reference to a physical place. This has really been profoundly kind of exposed or dealt with in a book called Erasing Hell. Francis Chan writes this with a couple of other co-contributors, and it's a really, really good book on hell. And it steps away from some of the, some of the more fundamentalist excesses when it comes to the doctrine. It also plays out certain varieties of views of the afterlife of the unsaved. But the idea that all Jesus' references to Gehenna were merely physical and metaphorical are in error. And I'm just going to give you the basic argument. And the basic argument is this, is that when you consider it in the context of what he says about people who go to Gehenna. So it's one thing to talk about Gehenna and that's a reference point to the Valley of Ben Hinnom, which is what he's referring to, and it was. But it had come to be understood in the Jewish mind in that intertestamental period after it was referred to by Jeremiah as a valley, there, in a place where basically he conducted a very stirring sermon to call the Jews away from Molech worship and the sacrifice of children and all that kind of stuff. So all that is a reference to this horrid valley just outside of Jerusalem. But Jesus then picks up on the common Jewish understanding that Gehenna had turned into an understanding of the damned in the afterlife. And as he describes what happens to people in hell, it is really clear that he's talking about a spiritual state, not merely a physical one.
Yeah, bedrock text. Just go to the book of Revelation, look at all the flames and fire.
Revelation is the most metaphorical book in the entire Bible, and it would be unwise to base any literal doctrine on it. It is filled with what scholars call apocalyptic hyperbole. It has all kinds of symbols, like beasts and dragons, and Jesus is pictured as a lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes. The fire and the flames Mark mentions are just about the only part of Revelation that he wants to take literally.
Yeah, and I guess, I don't know where this guy's coming from scripturally, but he does make a good point about Revelation. It is a highly apocalyptic book, a highly metaphorical book. The author tells you that these symbols mean these things. So I think I agree with him in that way. And so whether Mark is, talking about hell requiring or is a physical place of literal flames, that is a highly controversial position that I know of most evangelical pastors don't think that's a necessary way that we should look at hell. C.S. Lewis talks about this quite a bit in his talk about hell, and as he talks about it in his book Problem of Pain, that probably since the metaphors for hell in some sense are mutually contradictory, like in other words, it's a place of fire, but it's also called the outer darkness. How can a place full of fire, which is light, be dark? That these are in fact metaphors, and therefore what we're supposed to get is the some of the abstract qualities of the afterlife of the damned, those outside of relationship with God, and not the decor or the temperature.
Don't be deceived. God will not be mocked. You will reap what you sow. It's a dreadful and fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God.
This is ultimately why I reject the doctrine of hell, because it leads to an ugly picture of God. To fall into the arms of God is not a dreadful and fearful thing. It's a beautiful and life-giving thing. And that's the foundation of our relationship with God.
So, but at false dichotomy, like that you can have a beautiful God who is wooing his people and desiring relationship based on his unbelievable grace, can also be consistent with a God who would allow people to reject him. And in fact, I think that that's consistent with a God who does not coerce his creation. So what are we to imagine? That God yanks everybody into an eternal estate in his own presence, whether they want to or not? See, this is really the argument that C.S. Lewis makes in The Problem of Pain. You need to read that chapter. Just this chapter on hell alone is just worth the price of admission. So he talks about hell in this way. He says that the gates of hell are locked, in some sense, from the inside, and therefore that hell is, in some sense, a self-chosen fate. And yes, there are obviously several scriptures that talk about hell as sort of the result of a tribunal, right? That people are cast. But then it is also a sense of self-chosen, that people love darkness rather than the light, Jesus says, John chapter 3. So I think that case is the one I stick with, the idea that hell is consistent with a loving God insofar as a loving God does not coerce his creations to choose him, but in fact allows them to freely choose to be redeemed, to follow him, or to not. And so if you're a universalist, which is what I think this guy's leaning into, this idea that God saves everyone, whether they want to or not, in some sense you're really borrowing from the harsher deterministic wings of the Christian church that says God determines people to go to hell whether they want to or not. So in some sense, it's a weird unity or weird agreement between the harsh deterministic wings of Christendom and the universalistic wings of Christendom. They both agree, believe in a God who just is a bully God, who makes people do what he wants them to do, whether or not they want to do it. So what about a God who is so loving, and he creates people in freedom, knowing that there's no possible way that they can return love and live in love unless they're free to choose it. But if they're free to choose it, they're also free to not choose it, and that opens up the possibility of hell. And to me, that's how we create a consistent picture of a loving God with, nevertheless, a picture of people who could be lost for eternity. What that looks like, the specifics, I'm not married to anything that Driscoll's maybe implying here, and perhaps that's where the critique of this, it looks like I'm reading a former evangelical pastor, so I would be interested in this guy's story. So that's where I will agree with some of his critique, but that he throws out the doctrine entirely, I don't think that that's appropriate, just given, as Mark says, Driscoll says, how much Jesus talked about hell, and he comes back to it over and over again, and that it appears that the inhabitants are lost, not just physically lost, that they will come under God's physical judgment, but they are eternally and spiritually lost. If we're to give up on Jesus, the implication that Gehenna is a spiritual place, then we have to give up on the idea that the kingdom of heaven is a spiritual place. And then there's no afterlife promised in Jesus at all, one or the other. But because I think he's speaking of two fates, and they're both of the next world. If there's a hope for the world, for heaven in the next world, then his discussion of hell and must also be for the next world and not just for this one only. All right, so that's my take on this interesting video. I'm going to have to take a look at this guy and see what his background is. I wonder if he's one of those ex-evangelicals, or if he still retains the name of Christian. Not sure. I'll look into that. And until next time, I'll see you here on Pastor, Have You Seen This?